Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Roach. This is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. Now, if you look around here real quick, I want you to know something. We are doing a special episode today deep beneath the Carl Schmitt Library in order to ask this very important question. Are the Christian nationalists the woke right? Now, some of you might be wondering, why am I talking about Carl Schmitt, one of the key figures within the Third Reich, and why are we talking about this whole issue of Christian nationalism, so on and so forth? Well, the reason that we're going to talk about this today is that there's been this little debacle that has been taking place over the last, say, couple of years on who are these Christian nationalists? What are they all about? How should we react to them? Do they really have much influence? All the stuff that's related to that. And that's something that we've been addressing off and on through here. We've done conferences, we've done more. But today we're going to look at this whole issue of, we understand sort of like where the woke arose from. And we saw it within evangelicalism and broader culture. You see it in the media, you see it in the laws and so on and so forth. But the real question that I want to look at today is that, is there a counterpart to that? Is there another side that we could rightly label as the woke right? Now, before we do that, we, tend to do different things on this podcast. And a few things that I would just ask you to do is, first of all, if you could just please like and subscribe to this channel and just leave a comment down below on who you think is probably one of the main figures you've seen who claims to be a Christian nationalist. And, one of the reasons that we do this is that I want to foster a dialogue and a conversation related to this. Now, another thing that I want to look at is that just recently we had a few friends who came into town. They were traveling, and you'll see how this relates here. And we were going around downtown Raleigh because I live close to Raleigh, North Carolina. And we were looking at the historic sites, and we were looking, at the different things related to the state capitol and this. But what was interesting is that we went by this one area of town known as Moore Square. And Moore Square is a developing community, to say the less, or say what it is in this sense. And in that community, you have a lot of people that are homeless, that will try to rob you, that will try to do a whole variety of things. You've got a lot of the Black Hebrew Israelites that are out there. You got street preachers that are out there, but it's literally like right across the street from one of the nicest parts of Raleigh. So we walked through there during the daytime. It's not bad. But I remember one time I was telling this story that I went there with my wife, and we're going around, and inevitably what happens? Somebody's got to go to the bathroom. So we stop, and it was the middle of the day, and they've done a lot to redo this particular park. So there's a really nice sort of public facility. We went there, and I'm standing there, and I'm just looking around, and I noticed sort of a little commotion here, and people are watching it. And what's going on is that I'm clearly recognized, like, this is a distraction over here as two figures start to come around me. Well, that's very clear tactic. Like, whenever some guys want to try to rob you, they try to split the difference that's going on there. It's not two guys coming from one direction. It's usually they try to get somebody on both sides of you, and one guy kind of either has the knife or the gun, or they try to talk to you, and then the other guy takes your wallet or whatever. So we're there, and I'm telling my friends about this, and I was saying they had this distraction that took place, and I saw the two guys going around me, and I caught them. I caught them exactly right in the moment of it. And I looked both of them right square in the eye because they were kind of here. They weren't too far around. And I said, boys, this is going to be the worst mistake you've ever made in your entire lives. Because the truth is that, I've done high-end competitive grappling and striking martial arts for pretty much my whole youth, teenage, and adult life in this sense. Sort of like not my first rodeo dealing with competitive things. And also it's not my first rodeo of having somebody try to rob me out in public. And so what I did is I put my back up against the wall, and I squared them up. And I was very clear and very bold with them at that point. And ironically, it stopped them in the process. And if you say it forcefully enough, some of these guys will stop, some of them won't. It's the reality of it. But my point of all of that is that, we're done. My wife walks out, told her what happened. She would have had no clue with it. But have you ever noticed that whenever you see somebody who's trying to do something, they will sort of take control of, or they're going to utilize, or they're going to use something into their advantage where there's a distraction here, and they're going to split things in order to accomplish something else in another arena. And that's exactly what I think we're seeing going on here, is that when you look at sort of the dynamics of what goes on within wokeness, or the woke left, or the woke right, whichever one it is, you start to notice that there's this distraction that takes place, this horizontal issue. You get looking here and you get to looking there in order that they can achieve their goal. So like the goal with these guys in the park is that they wanted my money, and they were using all the different buzz of what's going on through there in order to achieve their end in that regard. I think another thing that we find is that as it relates to this is what's known as sort of like a dialectical form of warfare, in which you have large amounts of confusion, and there's a crew that's capitalizing upon that in order to achieve their goals. And what's interesting is that so much of modern thought today is based upon this very concept of create this chaos with one another in order to achieve sort of a vertical goal in this sense. And what this is rightfully known as is it's known as a dialectical warfare. And, you know, the key figures on this were Hegel, and most people are used to his stuff like the dialectic of the left. But a lot of people forget that, you know, Hegel wasn't just a man who just talked about his view. He's a man who operated according to his views. So he talked about what was known as the philosophy of right, which is really his categorizations on how these two things can come together. And in the buzz of these, you're achieving your vertical goals. And we've talked about this, and we've seen this, and we understand how this functions. And I think what was interesting is that as these things were taking place, we recognized how these linguistic things were happening within the woke left and how people were falling for them. You know, I can't tell you how many sermons I heard for why you should buy into critical theory as an analytical tool, because they turned to the book of Revelation and they said, you know, every tribe, tongue, and nation, you know, you got to love your Christian friends in this regard. And they use that as a justification to buy into critical theory. But here's one of the ways that I saw it work out the best. And you see the manipulation taking place. People would come up to you and they would say things like, you know, you believe in justice, right? And you as a Christian want to believe in justice, right? And the clear answers to that is that yes, I believe in justice. And yes, Christians should and do believe in justice. So there's really no debate there. And then the other aspect of it is they would start asking questions like, well, you know, justice is not just something that you should do. It's not just, you know, you act like a just person and you enact that in just the basic affairs of your life. You think that justice is, you know, not just you, but the way that you relate to your neighbor and the way that your neighbor relates to another figure in society and how a group of people start to relate to one another in society. So the point is that if you believe in justice and you are a just person, you would want to see that applied to the widest number of people. And almost, you know, you have private justice, but what about corporate public justice, also known as, you know, a social form of justice, where, you know, if you see a structure in society, or if you see something taking place in here, that you want to fix it or make a law in order to make it right. So the point is that the way it works is, you know, you believe in justice, right? Yeah. Well, you believe in the application of justice in a social sense, right? Like through laws and government. And inevitably people would typically go, well, sure. So then they would say, well, see, you shouldn't have a problem with what's going on right now because you believe in social justice. And, you know, they sort of cloak it in all these like old political things on like maybe the Republic or Aristotle's Politics and all these things about how virtue and ethic and all this stuff. But the whole point is that they're trying to get you to agree with both of those questions in order to give you this hybrid concept. And what you have to see is that social justice, rightly understood in like a classic sort of Aristotelian realist sense of the term, would not be incorrect in the sense that like, yeah, I want a just society, and you can call it, justice applied socially or whatever you want. But that is not what the woke and the woke left wanted it to be. We all recognize and we saw that it was this hybrid concept of not really justice anymore, but rather it was equity, equality of outcome. And we all used to see all these different memes that would go around, social justice is you have the tall guy standing at the fence and he's on this big wooden block, and you got the short guy who can't see it. So what he does is he gives his big little wooden block and he hands it to his short friend, and now they both can see equally over the fence. And man, is that a good Christian virtue, they would say, or a good righteous American virtue, or whatever it is. When the reality is that you're not like giving your wooden crate or box to the person. The guy, first and foremost, is stealing it from you. You're not just giving it to him. So in that sense, it's a redistribution of wealth. But the best one that I ever saw was actually what you're doing is you're like chopping the legs off of the tall guy and giving it to the short guy. And then he actually ends up not being able to see over the fence whereas the other guy can see over the fence. All of that to say is that we recognize how this worked, and a whole group of people and a variety of individuals in the church, out of the church, and the media started to pick up on this. And they recognized what it was a form of cultural Marxism, and it was a form of race Marxism that functioned with the net goal of equity and the redistribution of wealth or social capital and all the rest. Now, I think another thing has started to take place. People were capitalizing off of these power dynamics, and they were capitalizing upon these issues related to the fog and the chaos of the culture that we were in. And you started to get people that would come up to you and they would say, you're a Christian, right? Like you're not an atheist, or you're not a Muslim, you're not a Buddhist, like you're a Christian, right? Like you believe in the Bible. You believe that you should be born again, and that, you should have faith in Jesus Christ and faith in Jesus Christ alone for salvation. And because of that, you would call yourself a Christian. Sure, I do. And then they would say things like, you want to have a dynamic in life in which your nation flourishes. Like when you pay your taxes or when you participate in society, you care more about America than you do, say, Germany or France or Australia or any of the rest. Like you care about your nation, you care about your people in this regard. And, what you find is that would be understood as a form of nationalism with these framings of these questions. And I don't think in that regard, there's anything wrong with having an America first policy, or having you should be for your country first versus another country. Like there's an inherent truth to the reality and the virtue of taking care of your own. In fact, it's a very biblical idea. Paul talks about taking care of the household of faith prior to taking care of somebody else who's not a member of your family, or really the spiritual family in that regard, or in one of these. Or we see this idea of what Paul talks about if you don't take care of your family members. The principle of it is that you take care of your own first, whoever your own may be, in the various circumstances. So they would say things like, you believe in nationalism, and you recognize there can be different types of nationalism. You can have pagan nationalism or Buddhist nationalism, or you can have, global homo nationalism, or whatever they want it to be in this sense, all these different terms that people would use. But why not, if you recognize Christianity is true and you're worshiping the one true God, why wouldn't you want Christian nationalism? Now, on the base level there, you go, okay, I see exactly what you're saying. I want to be for my nation, and I recognize that God doesn't speak with a forked tongue. So the law of God given in the scriptures and the moral law have no real conflict. And if that's all that they were saying in this regard, I see how people could buy into it. But again, it's not just the Christian and the nationalism, and they put them together. It's creating a new hybrid concept that's coming about. Just like when you put social and justice together, you got something more than just justice applied socially. And in this sense, you're getting more than just Christianity applied to your nation. And that's where I think so much of this debate is coming down to is that people have to see that just like the whole issue where you have this distraction, this fog, you have a whole group of people out there who are capitalizing upon the very situation that we're finding ourselves in. This dialectical, what does this mean? What does that mean? Just like this, for example, people will always say things, well, how do you define social justice? What does it mean to be woke? You know, people would say, is this woke? Is that woke? And people will say, is this Christian nationalism? Is that Christian nationalism? And what you started to find was this interesting parallel that would take place, you know, inability to define it, except by the people who are the initiated within it. You know, this whole issue of what are the right consistent actions? Is there sort of like this, what does it mean to be an anti-racist? It's where you do the praxis of CRT in this regard. And I wonder if we could find and we could delineate this. This would be something interesting to do. Is there the proper praxis of Christian nationalism? Is there the proper epistemology of Christian nationalism and all the rest? So what I want to do here is I want to respond to something that was on Twitter or X in this regard. And the reason that I want to do this is that I want us to understand a little bit more about this dynamic that's at play and dive a little bit into this whole issue of, are Christian nationalists the woke right? And what I want you to see is parallels. Like, I don't ever expect them to admit it. You know, I mean, it's funny. You never get people to accept the label, because once you accept the label of something, it radically like codifies you into a particular view. Like, for example, the woke in general, especially in the height of it, never wanted to be called woke. They'd always, you know, go back and forth. And it's like, well, what is woke? Woke is calling everything racist until you control it, as James Lindsay used to say. And it's funny because we were chatting about this, and it's like, well, what's a Christian nationalist? Well, it's calling everything secular or whatever until they control it. And I just want you to start thinking, maybe do this in your own, think about parallels on it. So I'm going to sort of transfer over here, and we're going to look at a tweet that I put out, but I want you to look at the context of the tweet first. So Andrew Torba, based Torba, which that's a key. You got to understand, they all like this word based. It's one of their sort of flagship terms that they use and all the rest. And Andrew Torba put out a book on Christian nationalism. And in that book, he talks about what it's going to mean. And he calls it an integralist system, which is this idea of fusing sort of church and state, in which you want the state to enforce the particularities of church doctrine. So it's almost like the legal enforcement of Christian doctrine. And that's what, you know, figures some in Roman Catholic ideology, some into the Reformation, and in this regard, where it was what was known as a form of integralism, or it was this idea of you use, like we said, it's the use of the state to enforce particular theological doctrines. We're going to give a couple examples of this. He says this: it is safe to say that Christian nationalism is now mainstream, which is utterly false. It's just mainstream in certain circles. So, which is good. Now he's going to go on to say that was the goal. Our biggest threat as a movement is subversion from within by Judaizers. If the movement is reduced to Judeo-Christian nationalism, it loses all its salt and light, separating the wheat from the chaff while we continue to build momentum in the current objective. So a few things to notice is this. Look at the key things. They have goals. They have objectives. They want to separate the wheat from the chaff. They want to be mainstream. they want to have influence. Another way of saying you want to have influence is you want to have power. And that's what these people are ultimately striving for. Now we recognize in one sense, power can be used in a good way, but power can be corrupted. And that's what you're finding with these people. These people want power to make changes, but the changes that they want to make are not going to be changes that are going to really benefit you. It's going to benefit them. Like, for example, this whole idea of, maybe we're just being bound by the restrictions of the Constitution. Right now, election season, maybe we need to get rid of the Electoral College, just give it to the popular vote. Maybe we need to get rid of all these rights that were there. We're not living in that time. It's because what you're going to find is that the woke left are post-liberal, but they're also post-constitutional. Well, what's interesting is that a figure like Torba is functionally the same thing. They're post-liberal, meaning the liberal order of society, the liberal concept of faith and reason coming together, really the basis of the United States Constitution, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, so on and so forth. And they equally are post-constitutional. They would have no problem with rewriting so many aspects of the Constitution. And that's why when you look at this, our biggest threat as a movement is subversion from within by Judaizers. Now, anybody who knows what Judaizers are, is the Galatian heresy that Paul was dealing with in the book of Galatians, where they wanted to add the law, they wanted to add the Judaism onto it in this sense and the particularities of it. And he called them false brethren. He says, for I'm astonished that you were so quickly deserting him who called you by the gospel of God or gospel of grace in this sense, from birth in this sense, and you are turning to a different gospel. And notice what he's saying here. If the movement is reduced to Judeo-Christian nationalism, it loses all its salt and light. Torba in particular does not like Judaism. He does not like the Judeo concept. It's funny because many of these guys are, which is really funny, they're theonomists, which is a clearly given thing from the Old Testament, and yet they hate the Judeo-Christian concept that's there. And the reason is that, I'll just say it for what it is, they're anti-Semites. And if you will follow the literature, you follow the debate, you see what's going on here, they do not like the Jews. So the point that you're having to see here, to summarize, they think they're mainstream, but they have goals. They're using these different debates and these different issues are going on. What's a Christian nationalist? What's this? In order to achieve their goals, they have objectives. They recognize threats to their movement. And it's interesting how this works is that they see people who would come from within, people who might not fully align, people who aren't the pure. Didn't the woke do the same thing? Like the woke left, you're not a pure social justice guy if you don't believe in this. You're not pure if you don't do all of that. So that said, let's look a little bit more at the response here. So I said this, I've never seen so much gaslighting as there has been concerning Christian nationalism. This movement is all about power and virtually nothing about Christianity. And I really do stand behind that. And I'm not going to say all people who happen to fall for the manipulation of Christian nationalists are not Christians. But what I am saying is that this movement as a movement is so far detached from biblical Christianity that one could rightfully make the case that it is no longer Christian, and the Christian nationalism is something else. It's kind of becoming its own form. Just like the issue of how you deal with counter cult issues is that you can equivocate on your terms so much that you're virtually not talking about the same thing if you're not in actuality not talking about the same thing anymore. And that's what I think you have going on here is that Torba readily admits they have objectives and they have power dynamics that they want to control in order to enact their agenda. And I say this, don't be tricked into the next level of their gaslighting, believing one, this is the next big divide within the church and you better get on the right side, which is, of course, Christian nationalism. Now, I do agree this is a divide within the church. You see it as this whole issue of people aren't really staying in the middle on Christian nationalism, just like people stop staying in the middle on the whole woke issue. But just like I could say this about the woke, this is not, or don't be gaslit into believing that this is the next big divide within the church, and you better get on the right side, which is, woke, CRT, and so forth. My point is that you can believe that this is a divide, and you can get on the right side of this, and you can refrain from calling yourself a Christian nationalist. In fact, what was really interesting is like the concept of Christian nationalism that they were putting out, like I think there were sort of seed forms of it, but it was not mainstream for years on end. Like my views have never changed as it relates to several of these things. It's not in a lot of popular literature that people would have learned in seminaries and all the rest. And people could say, well, that's post-war boomercon, whatever. My point is that they're not as mainstream as they think they are. And they're giving you this false bifurcation. You're either for us or you're against us. Carl Schmitt, friend enemy distinctions in that regard, but also it's a logical false distinction in the sense, you're either a Christian nationalist or you're something else, and you better fall on the right side. But there's a lot of rhetoric being used in that regard. Another one that's really interesting is the no true Scotsman. No true Scotsman would ever believe. And it's like this radical purity test that people try to bring about. Same thing here. No Christian nationalist would ever believe in, and then they just run with it. And it's like, are those my only two options? Seems like a sad reality to find ourselves in. The next, that, don't be gaslit into believing that the Christian nationalists are somehow the faithful remnant left over from the battles of the woke left wars. There are many people who fought that battle. Many, many, many people who have not bought into this. This purity test that they're giving you is just not a true test of the lay of the land that's out there. And, I hesitate to even name names because I won't be able to get enough names, but it's like, okay, let's use one. John MacArthur fought the woke left. John MacArthur has also spoken out against Christian nationalism. Oh, is he somehow not faithful? Is he not part of that faithful remnant that's out there? Or what's really interesting is that if they think you're going to be a real threat to your movement, regardless of what you've done on the woke stuff, regardless of how much capital you've spent, either fiscal capital, practical capital, social capital, whatever on this, they are going to just jump upon you. And what's interesting, and I say this as a person who's watched this, I found it really interesting to see the dynamics that they dealt with Sovereign Nations and O'Fallon and James Lindsay. There have probably been no figures who have dealt with this more than them. James Lindsay is one of the world experts on critical theory. And Michael O'Fallon, especially, you remember the rooftop interview with James and Peter and O'Fallon in this regard? I remember that blew the lid off of this issue. The Dallas Statement on social justice. But you know what? Namely, O'Fallon has always pushed back against the concept of being a Christian nationalist. He saw it as integralism. He saw it as post-constitutional. He saw it all as, and when you watch these figures blow up, because he's calling out their manipulations, and you see the gaslighting, and you see the people that it's like, you can't be a friend of O'Fallon and a friend of these people, even though you fought the woke wars. And it's like this massive purity test. What's interesting, I think actually the one that I saw the most manipulation on was on just ways they've done it on Twitter with Jack Posobiec, who is a man who is a Catholic Christian nationalist in this regard. And he just he lost it on this because they all know that figures like Lindsay and O'Fallon and many others now, many, many more, they've seen the manipulation. Like, they're calling the bluff. They know exactly what's going on. So don't tell me that if you're not a Christian nationalist, you're somehow like not following the Bible, you've compromised. Like, again, it's a false bifurcation that they're giving you here. The third, don't be gaslight into believing they're actually mainstream and a unified movement. What's interesting is that just because certain people are talking about it in the mainstream media doesn't mean that you are a mainstream group of people with that much influence. Like, for example, You know who has way more influence mainstream wise today? The Democrat or the Republican parties. So like, oh, we're this major political movement. You guys have less influence on the ballots than the Libertarian Party gets in any given election. Your local election, your election for dog catcher within any particular town, more or less some kind of federal election that's going to take place. Get my point? Like, they're not mainstream, even though the mainstream media is using them. Like, you have no actual place. You're not one of the parties in politics anywhere. You just have a strong Twitter presence. Now, what's happening is there's an aspect of they're trying to hijack different ones. Like, for example, the woke left hijacked the Democratic Party. And there's an aspect in which the woke right is going to try to hijack the Republican Party. And, you know, you're going to see this through different figures like the General Flynn, you know, the whole Gnostic cult things that he was projecting forward on people. That's a hijacking of it. Finding people that used to work in the Trump administration and get them to weave their ways into different church groups and say, we're saving the Southern Baptist Convention. When the reality is that same figure said, you know, we have to save the Southern Baptist Convention because of their voting bloc, because of their power within that voting bloc. The whole point is that you got to see it for what it is, and you got to see people that are trying to come in to take over these different types of organizations. Just want to keep going here. Said there were several figures who fought the woke who by no means would ever align with the Christian nationalist movement. Me, for one, and many others. First of all, here's some of the reasons. The CN, or CN is a shorthand for Christian nationalism, for those of you who have a life and don't follow this kind of stuff most of the time, they're a collectivist movement, much like the woke were a collectivist movement. And here's what I want you to see, is that they want different groups to come together, almost like a herd mentality within this. And there's these radical purity tests for it. And they act like if we as a whole collective group can come together and fight this, then we'll have success. And there is some truth to the concept of a collective can have very, very strong influence on something. But what I mean by collectivist is that you only have rights within the collective, and it undermines the concept of you have rights and freedoms and privileges and things as an individual. Why can't you have individual rights and individuals can come together for end goals? Like as individuals come together for a purpose of the end goal of passing a law or something like this. And that's not how it functions. Like the other thing is, and I talk about this on the woke left, I think it can apply here, is that I call it let's just do it the math in this sense, the 102-man argument. So you have 50 people in each room. And let's just say 50 people in this room, we'll use the woke left kind of concept, are all people who have all the right leftist intersectionality points. We'll just say they're people of color, they are transgender, they are of a not so approved religion, or whatever we want to have. Like they got them all, like they check all the boxes. And in the other one here, you've got straight white men who are Christians. And these two groups come together and they're going to say these two groups have a particular metaphysic or a particular epistemology or a particular ethic and all these different things. And that this group, what's interesting is that they almost take on a life of their own. Hence 50-50, 1 and 1. The 1 over this 50, it's as though the dominant thing is whatever the identity intersectionality point is of this. And it thinks for itself, and you always conform unto this, and you always sort of heed unto this. And a similar thing they're going to say is like the white Western white male, is they have their collective concept, and each person within that collective concept functions, thinks, acts, so on and so forth. But the problem is that groups don't think. People think. And what ends up happening is if you come up against them, they kick you out of the group immediately. But you also have to deal with the fact that you have counterexamples to the groupthink concept that they're putting forward. For example, Thomas Sowell has shown this whole idea that it is a deeply racist thing to think that all African Americans think the same way and must think the same way and must act the same way. Why? Because you're stereotyping people according to their race. We could say that about any kind of group here. The point is, you have counterexamples to it, and we know how they have dealt with the counterexamples in the left. They ridicule, mock, push them out, so on and so forth. In fact, what's interesting is you saw this happening recently with the whole Kamala Harris concept and how she tried to use Obama to say, we don't got the brothers. Where are the brothers? Expecting every black man to vote the same way. Well, similarly, you see the woke right doing the same thing. Christian nationalists all must act the same way, think the same way, but you find counterexamples. In fact, the movement's radically disorganized and it's radically not actually a good collective group. You find people within it that hold opposing views on the essential tenets of the movement all the time. And the purity test finds that the group keeps getting smaller, smaller, and smaller. And if you somehow differ with them on one of them, well, then you're one of the Judaizers that Andrew Torba is talking about. My point is this, is that the collectivism undermines, one, the fact of reality that you have counterexamples, and two, the collectivism doesn't function in a real sense. It's a mirage in that regard because they're not all functioning, pointing in the same way. And in particular, the collectivism fundamentally guts the necessity, the reality, and the objective right of individual liberties and freedoms. Two, a few reasons people aren't. Christian nationalism is concerned with power dynamics very equivalent to the woke. They want to use the situations here in order to put their boys in power or their girls in power or whoever they want to put in power in that regard. And what's interesting is that on the woke left side of things, we saw them taking the lead in this regard as it relates to school boards, as it relates to local councils, as it relates to federal government. And you're seeing these other figures try to do the same thing. But what's interesting is that there's a very well-known reality that we're working towards sort of a digital world. And I think you're going to see these figures work very hard and very intentionally toward sort of trying to get that whole digital world under their control. And that's going to be currency. That's going to be, creating housing groups. That's going to create all these different things in order that they can function as a counter parallel society. So in that regard, they tip their hats to the Amish. You're going to have your own little special society here. In addition to it, just for the sake of time, another reason, they work to enforce regulations in a way equivalent to religious cancel culture upon society, namely blasphemy laws, which are promoted as seeking Christ, but in reality, and viewed historically, have consistently undermined religious liberty. And I give two examples, Fritz Erba and Mary Dyer. I say these are very similar to the religious cancel culture mandates from the woke, which is race Marxism, which antecedently functions as a religious expression than a fiscal policy. Properly translated, Marxism is not just a theory on economics. Marxism functions as a religion. The central sin is class differences and class oppressions, and the central salvation is liberty from those unto, or through the means of revolution unto your utopia. So in this sense, what happens is that we saw how these people work. If you don't fall into the thing that the woke left called their utopia, well, then you get Columbia University and you get all of the riots that were taking place. We're doing this because of Judaism and anti-Semite issues, they would say, when the reality is that they don't really care about what brings about the revolution. They just want to divide and conquer and have revolution in this sense. And anybody who didn't, toe the line with the woke, anybody that didn't go along with Resolution 9, or somebody that didn't go along with changing your syllabi or whatever crazy school board or whatever it was, They used the social capital that they had to utterly manipulate you, fire you, move you on, and all the rest. So in that sense, I see why there was a reaction to it, because that is just flat out ridiculous. And everybody knows it. Everybody's seen it. Everybody understands the madness. Like, nobody's hiding it anymore. But what's interesting is that the woke right tried to do the exact same thing. And it's interesting because people are going to say, everybody has blasphemy laws. It's just a matter of whose blasphemy laws that are out there. And then they pivot to like a natural law, or they pivot to some, you can only legislate morality. So there's a few things in here. First of all, you have to see that they're promoting what's known as a form of integralism. And integralism is this idea that you must enforce church doctrine through the state. And I give the two examples here of how it undermines religious liberty. Fritz Urba, who was killed for being a Baptist, Mary Dyer in the United States, who was killed for being a Quaker. One was drowned and one was hung in this regard. So historically, we recognize what this leads to and the necessity of religious freedom. Second of all, when it comes to this whole issue of, blasphemy laws, we have to recognize that there's a difference between making a law for something that is moral or immoral and, punishing somebody for doing an act that's immoral versus the legislation of religious ideals in this regard. So very particular things. So it's a difference between murdering and not murdering somebody than it is somebody broke the Sabbath law. There's a difference between that. Or between somebody not doing a particular thing on a particular day in a particular way that's according to your particular religion in this sense. Like, for example, you see some people within certain subset religious communities who, if you don't dress a particular way, you're kicked out of the group. So, the Amish, if you don't have the right beard and the things and all the rest, in that sense, or as we used to say, an Amish rebel and flush a toilet someday. If you don't live according to the ideals, you're kicked out. And what's interesting is that when you read the literature of these figures who are Christian nationalists, they want religious blasphemy laws, but they hide it under the idea of natural law, moral legislation in this sense. And I go, no, there's just a radical difference between enforcing the natural moral law in this sense and what you're trying to do with your blasphemy laws. In that sense, they want to banish, imprison, or kill people who might be an atheist. And it's a short thing to go from an atheist to a cult to a denomination on the way that these things are going to function. You go, well, that's just, you're special pleading in this sense, or, you are, you might be pushing something in the sense that that's such a slippery slope in this regard. I go, no, a slippery slope is only a fallacy if you use it fallaciously. And when you have figures like Fritz Urba and Mary Dyer sitting there sort of looking over your shoulders, no, it's not a slippery slope. Finally here, the objectives that they want undermine rights and freedoms enshrined into the U.S. Constitution, because at their core, many of these figures are post-liberals and post-constitutional. We've talked about that. So I finish off by saying this. Truth be told, the movers and shakers behind much of the Christian nationalist movement are a small group of people who've worked into traditional settings, churches, media outlets, chat rooms, in order to secure influence and power. This gives them the appearance of significant influence. However, this is far from the reality when you consider the full range of movements in society, both quantitatively and in terms of impact. Like, for example, the Libertarian Party will get more votes next week at the presidential election than the Christian Nationalist Party will get, or any Christian nationalist figure that is in, say, a Republican Party or a Libertarian Party. Guarantee it. You do not have the numbers and you do not have the impact that you think you have. In addition to this, I said they are capitalizing on the confusion over Christian nationalism in order to rapidly advance their objectives. Namely, they are taking advantage of the culture confusion, the horizontal confusion, the horizontal aspect of the dialectic, in order to achieve their objectives, their vertical goals in this sense. You got the guys in the park in the very beginning, causing a distraction with the goal of taking my wallet. So in that sense, they are achieving their ends via the same dialectical means as the woke or woke left. Hence, when understood with the full objectives described above, gives reasonable justification to label them as the woke right. I said, one of the best ways to respond to this movement is to call out the manipulations as they take place while simultaneously educating society about the objectives they seek to obtain. Ergo, what we're doing right now. It says, this is how many people in America initially went from embracing critical theory and woke ideology to largely understanding and rejecting the critical theory and woke ideology. I say similarly, many Christians, conservative Christians in particular, have embraced what they considered virtuous elements of Christian nationalism. But when they actually understand the manipulations and objectives of Christian nationalism, they quickly reject them for what they really are. They're the woke right. So that said, what I ask for you to do is consider what we were saying here. Like, share, comment on this, send it to your buddy, send it to your friend. Do whatever you need to, because I'm letting you know that this thing has gone from, in many respects, something that people are like, oh, that's interesting. What is that? To they recognize for what it is. It's sort of a fringe movement that has ulterior motives, ulterior goals, power dynamics, and all the rest that they want to. And I think the best way to do this is educate yourself and educate the people that you know. And I don't think we're going to see this much longer. You know, it could be here sort of in perpetuity in that regard. But I think people are catching on. People are recognizing what's going on here. But now is the time, once you finally start to communicate and people are starting to catch on to the counter narrative, now is the time to talk about it even more. So keep talking about it more. So in that regard, thank you. I appreciate all of you. Again, please like and subscribe these videos.